Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thy Strong Word. I'm Pastor H.A. Espinosa. We're reading the entire Bible together, chapter by chapter, reading it out loud, and we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 23. We have already had this theme set up. We just had that yesterday, how we have this picture, really, of Christ, of how David risks his life and puts himself in the line of fire for the sake of, well, really, I mean, everyone around him and God's people, but particularly the people who are in distress. And you see that in a big way here because he risks a confrontation with Saul so that he would save this city from the Philistines. So just another really cool story. It's, one like where there's a lot of battle and movement and all this, but a lot of little pieces and details here, inquiring of the Lord, seeking God's will in all of this. A lot of neat contrast, so a lot to talk about today. Today, we are joined by our guest, Pastor Curtis Deterding, pastor at Zion Lutheran Church in Fort Myers, Florida. Good morning, brother. How are you and the saints in Fort Myers doing?
We're doing just fine. Everything's been going very smoothly. We are getting into the process of hopefully opening up our church for in-person worship. We have not done that yet, so this will be new for us after all these months, and we'll see how that goes.
Well, okay, yeah. Well, peace and blessings. I mean, it's a great thing to be able to have that opportunity, and I know that I'm sure there's a lot of preparation that's gone into that, and probably a little bit of nervousness, excitement with that, but I hope it goes well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, the excitement's about halfway because there's so many guidelines and so forth that we're going to be following going into the worship that, it's not going to look the same as, we're not going to be able to rejoice the way we'd like to whenever we come back into the Lord's presence together there around Word and Sacrament. So, but, we're going to take our time, be cautious, and continue to show love to neighbor and do what we can to make a safe environment so that we can enjoy gathering together once again to give thanks to God for all his gifts.
Well, and I think that this theme that you raise here, this idea of, well, okay, there's risks and you need to mitigate things, you need to take precautions, right? But there are certain risks that are worth taking for the sake of God's people. I mean, that is what we're talking about in not Psalm 23, 1 Samuel 23. Though I really am reminded of a number of psalms here. And in fact, there might even be one that refers to this, and maybe we'll talk about that. But I mean, it's just fascinating to me how it's just such a very clear picture of how David. I mean, he really just puts himself on Saul's radar, and he could have just been hiding out and kept being stealthy, but he puts himself in a very difficult situation between a rock and a hard place, kind of literally here. But I mean, between the Philistines and Saul.
Yeah, and I think that, people who truly want to follow God's will and to be faithful to the tasks that God gives is definitely revealed here in this story, because we look at it as just David taking the risk, but you've got to also remember that God is there with him, guiding him and giving him direction on what to do, and that he promises David he will be with him, and that makes a big difference too in our boldness and in our courage when we know that the Lord is with us. Absolutely.
I mean, it's we might not be fighting against the Philistines, but sometimes actually you might describe it that way, right?
But right. Depends on what it is in life,
That's right. The idiom of the Philistines. That's another thing. But well, brother, let's go ahead and turn to the chapter. And as we do, would you start us off with a prayer?
Absolutely. Almighty God, and we call you mighty because it is by your might that we can go into each day knowing that you are with us, to watch over us, to protect us, to give us strength to face whatever fears there may be. We know that as we continue to read about David and the fears that he had of those around him and those around him who were also fearful of others, that could threaten their lives, their very lives. We know that there are all kinds of threats in our own life that attack us and come up against us almost daily in some cases. We pray that you would be with all of those who are suffering at the hand of sickness, at the hand of abuse, at the hand of violence, and we pray that you would be with them and give them hope for better days ahead, relying on you and your will, that you can continue to shower your gifts of peace, of hope, of comfort upon those who seek it, just as David sought your help and your strength in his time of need. Bless us now as we continue our study, that we might truly know that will is that you have for us in our lives as we continue to seek to follow you. We thank you and praise you for where we have not done that, and give you thanks for the forgiveness and mercy you showed to us in your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we ask for your blessing upon our time together this day. Amen.
Amen. All right, so reminding us a little bit of some of the characters here. So we've got, so obviously we've got David. The Philistines have kind of been in the background for a little bit. We had that encounter with David 2 chapters ago, or it was in the first half of the previous chapter where he goes to Gath just very briefly. At least in the span of the narrative, but we haven't had necessarily the fighting with the Philistines for a little bit. We have this really eclectic bunch, the people who are down and out, the people who it says are bitter in soul, who are there with David. So he's got some people with him. It's not a large number. I think the number 400 was given there. So those are kind of like the little bit of the situation here. It's not like he's totally off of everybody's radar. A word has spread about his location, that he is on the move, that he's got a crowd with him, and he has particularly also this one prophet. We're told back in the previous chapter, it was Gad, the prophet, who seems to be tagging along with him, and more than that, he has the last survivor of Nob. Well, not necessarily the last survivor, but anyway, the only priest, it would seem, that survived from Nob. In Abiathar, who seems to be kind of the last remnant of Eli's house. So that's kind of the situation. Anything else we need to be thinking about in the context, or just anything that'd be good to kind of review or have in mind when we give this a read-through?
The chapter before mentioned a number of people, and so, just trying to keep them all straight, and trying to go over each and every one of them is really not going to be worth our time right now, because what we do need to know is that, a number of the priests were killed, and that was huge. That was a big step, where his group, Saul's group, were not willing to kill them, and I'm not sure how you've been pronouncing it, Doeg or Dog.
Doeg, yeah.
Doeg. So Doeg has been he stepped up to the plate and followed Saul's command. So to turn and kill all the priests of the Lord, that's huge. And of course, it's all being blamed on David, and so David's got a lot on him all the way around.
No, that's right, and And you might also think, it's an interesting connection to kind of draw out. It seems like he sort of blames himself, or, I guess that might be reading too much into it, but it might be the case that he blames himself for what happened to Nob. And so you wonder if on a certain level when he hears about, here in this chapter we've got Keilah, when he hears about Keilah being attacked by the Philistines, if he's saying to himself, there's no way I'm going to let another city go down on my watch. And, he does inquire of the Lord, but you wonder how much that might kind of play into the emotion of this moment.
Well, yeah, and not only that, but those that are with him, they were saying, we already have enough trouble with the Philistines just staying at home and trying to guard ourselves, let alone go off into another place altogether where we have no refuge, no promise of refuge, against the Philistines. Let's go fight our enemies somewhere else. That was a lot on those people that David was praying would be faithful to him and to the task that the Lord was giving them.
Certainly. Well, let's go ahead and give a read through then. 1 Samuel chapter 23 from the top here in the English Standard Version. Now they told David, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors." Therefore David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, "Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. When Abiathar the son of Ahimelech had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, "God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars." And Saul summoned all the people to war, to go down to Keilah and besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then David said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will come down." Then David said, "Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul?" And the Lord said, "They will surrender you." Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition, and David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. Then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon? Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand." And Saul said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go, make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him there, for it's told me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go with you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah in the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore, that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. Very interesting at the end how, it's just so fascinating here. You get this, the Rock of Escape. And of course, we're familiar with all the language that is in the Psalms of referring to God as my rock. So, pretty interesting that God seems to be at work through the Philistines, right? In one case, right, God is sending David to rescue his people from the Philistines. And in this other instance, it seems like he's allowing the Philistines to attack to save David. It's a pretty interesting reversal right there. But I'm just overall, it's an exciting chapter too, because you're just like, oh man, like they're going to get him now. But he just barely squeaks by.
Yeah, and I think that, it's a very interesting twist, to go from going to fight the Philistines to now have the Philistines actually distract and actually pull away David's enemy, Saul, and, away from him in battle. That is really, it just reminds you again, and we see this throughout all the Old Testament stories, how God uses even the enemies of his people to bring about blessing. And this is one of those times where you can see that, full blast. And that God is truly a God who's almighty and in control, the one who gives strength and power. When God says that he will deliver you from the hands of whoever, it's going to be done. It's good as done when he speaks that word. And so that's what I was saying at the very beginning, too, of our time together here today,
right.
Is that, David has something more than just his own will. He has the will of God on his side, and God always gives strength and hope to those who call upon him in time of need in miraculous ways, even when it looks like the enemy is going to win or the enemy is defeating us. Praying to God for his strength and his will in certain situations. We can all see things in that happen in our lives where this takes place. But again, I think the important part of all of this is that knowing where to turn in time of trouble, and that we see from David over and over again, that he's constantly connecting with the Lord.
Well, and I think that's that idea of the inquiring of the Lord. It's very prominent here, and you see it, and I think this is pretty interesting too, because I think we underestimate this, right? But the whole idea of siege warfare, right, and besieging a city, and that this is just a scary thing in the ancient world, but it happened all the time, and pretty much it's just a matter of you don't actually have to spend your whole army, all your men on a fight. All you have to do is just cut off a city from their material resources, and after enough people die of starvation, you've taken the place. And this is a very scary thing because, for these different cities, these places where David is hiding out, David's a curse. If David's there and Saul's after him, right. you don't want to be the place where David decides to go next, and Saul comes looking. So there's a. I think that we don't appreciate that. You can see that there's a really big. It's a big deal because it's big enough for David to say, "Hey, get the ephod," which we know that means it's got the Urim and Tumim, so that we can decide, hey, are they going to give me up, right, or are they going to be bold right. and stick it out with me? That is a really live question for David, and it's what's occasioning really the inquiring that's going on here.
Yeah, there's a couple of other things here that are kind of interesting in the story itself. Is that David goes to attack the Philistines to save Keilah, and then when it comes to a time where David could actually use their help, he's calling upon the Lord. Are they going to surrender us over to Saul, the very people that we came to help? And that you find interesting. Those outside the people of God are not trustworthy and it makes you wonder, why was it that Keilah was not willing to surrender, or was not willing to fight with them and to help them hold their ground. And of course, one of the things that we hear is that it's like a fortress, that they could surround and it's like you said, cut them off from their supplies and so forth.
Right.
Until they finally surrender. And that's another interesting thing that I caught when reading through this, is that a city with bars and walls and gates, you'd think that that's a stronghold. Yeah. Well, in this case, they show it as a weakness to actually be fortified like that. That was interesting to read as well. Yeah, no, I mean that is fascinating, right? That it can be. I mean, in some circumstances it's an advantage, and in others it's anything but. I mean, what's the difference, right, between like a fortress and a prison? Right. It's just which side of the bars you want to be on, right? I mean, exactly. I mean that's all it is. I mean, it is very circumstantial. Well, yeah, I mean, lots of interesting things. I think too, another big thing is the way that Jonathan explicitly acknowledges the kingship or the right to the throne for David. I want to spend some time talking about that, but let's go ahead then and just kind of start from the top here and kind of take this a little bit, bit by bit, kind of thinking about this first part together here before we get to the break in a couple minutes here. So, I mean, David gets this news, because people, as we saw in the previous chapter, well, I mean, hey, mom and dad and all of Bethlehem seems to have shown up to like support David, bring him care packets or something, So some people do know where he is, and so people are able to reach him with this message about Keilah. We know that he's got quite the reputation. I mean, we saw that with the Philistines in Gath. So they're calling on him, which is kind of interesting all by itself. But yeah, then he inquires of the Lord first before the attack. And why do you suppose? I mean, I don't know. This is just interesting all by itself. Why do you suppose he decides? Well, I need to inquire first before we go out. And then of course he has to inquire again, as you mentioned at the beginning, right? Because his men are like, hang on a second, we have enough problems just with Saul. So, what do you make of these inquiries? Well, I think in terms of, I think David definitely was fully aware of the importance of him when it came to the nation of God, of God's people. And so to just do something on his own without knowing what God's will is in these things is just not like David, especially at this time when he's running from Saul and trying to figure out what his next move should be. Why would you not want to turn to the one that can give you the direction, can give you the answers to what may lie ahead? And that's, David always turns to the Lord. You pretty much always see him turning, especially at a time like this, when he knows that somebody is being abused and that, fought against and so forth, that they are stealing from Keilah, and this is their enemy as well. Is this a time to be doing that? Is that something that they should be involved with? Because this is not their people, and I think that was part of why David felt that it was important, because he's really following the will of God even all the way up to this point. Why wouldn't he continue to do that? Well, I think so. I mean, he's not going to go and inquire of any other god, certainly. I think that in this. Well, I'm going to save that. It's time for our break already. But everybody, hold on. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 23 here on Thy Strong Word. We'll be right back.
do I keep my kids in church? Will there still be a church for them to go to? New people have moved into my neighborhood. How do I reach out to them?
Our challenges are many, but it is Jesus who makes disciples for life through his church. Let's come together as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod to discuss this joyful work. Learn more about the Making Disciples for Life initiative at lcms.org/makingdisciples. Again, that's lcms.org/makingdisciples.
The idea that our creation is the result of a fluke, an accident, is ridiculous. 100,000 monkeys typing on 100,000 typewriters, even after 1,000,000 years, would never produce the works of William Shakespeare.
But they might produce several episodes of Wrestling with the Basics, Saturday mornings at 9 a.m.
on air or on demand.
A click away 24 hours a day at kfuo.org.
The thing about God is He's winning even when it doesn't look like He's winning. Maybe especially when it doesn't look like He's winning. Dr. Michael Ziegler begins a series of messages based on the book of Daniel that tells how God uses history as a vehicle to bring about His eternal kingdom. That's this week on The Lutheran Hour.
Sundays at 12:30 and 5 p.m. on Worldwide KFUO.
Strong Word. I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 23. We're joined by our guest today, Pastor Curtis Deterding, pastor at Zion Lutheran Church in Fort Myers, Florida. If you're listening live and you got a question or a comment for us, give us a call, 1-800-730-2727. Or if you're in St. Louis, 314-821-0850. You can also send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. Or hop on the live stream, facebook.com/AJ Espinosa. One of the questions that just came in on there was about these ephods, or the ephod, question being, how many of these things are there? Is there something special about this one in particular? I remember that when we read about the ephod back in Exodus, there was one in particular that had to do with the high priest, with this the Umim and the Urim and the Tumim. So, that's a fair question here. I think we talked a little bit about the high priesthood stuff, and I think that actually kind of gets back to the question that we were talking about right beforehand about. So, why exactly is he doing this inquiring of the Lord? Get to that in just one second. I want to make sure to thank our underwriters at the Lutheran Heritage Foundation. Thank you guys for supporting Thy Strong Word. Their website is lhfmissions.org, the Lutheran Heritage Foundation. Okay, so turning back to this question here, I think that we want to be aware that this term here, inquired of the Lord, is a little bit of a technical term. And I think that we kind of, might just kind of think like, so he prayed, or, he just kind of, prayed like, God, what's your will? Kind of like we might. But in the Hebrew, this kind of inquired of the Lord idea has more to do with an official question of, let's go find the priest or the high priest, right? And let's get like this official word. And the same way that they inquired about, hey, who has God, picked as king, right, when they were going through the tribes and they narrowed it down to Saul. Or, hey, which lot is going to fall to which tribe when they were casting the lots with Moses, right? So I'm thinking here, and especially given the context, that he's able to do this because Abiathar is there. I mean, in light of what happens later, is that how you're reading this?
Yeah, that's exactly how I'm reading it. I remembered that in my study too. That they actually feel that they believe that I've called him Abiathar, but where he had used prophets, because the prophets are the ones that you go to inquire when it comes to God about these matters. So it definitely doesn't say that he himself went there, and because of that, you probably would assume that it was probably the prophet that he turned to in that case.
I'm sorry, the prophet Gad or
Gad or Abiathar.
okay.
I don't know if Abiathar might still be there or not. As far as with. I'm pretty sure I have that
sure.
right. Do I not have that right? I thought right before this it says in verse 21 of chapter 22, and Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord, and David said to Abiathar, "I knew that on that day." I didn't know if he was still part of what was going on here or not.
Oh, sure. Okay. No, okay, I got you. It's true because it doesn't explicitly say that.
No, it doesn't.
That it's him, right? But this inquiring thing, like I was saying, it's only something that you do with the priests. So it's sure, like there can be a question on people's minds that a prophet addresses, right? But this inquiring idea, this is something that is you go to the priest, and typically there's kind of like a ceremony with this, and usually there'd be sacrifices among other things as well. So I think that with verse 23 where he says, come stay with me, do not be afraid. I think the strong implication of the text is that the priest stays with him, partly because he's got nowhere else to go, because Saul has decided to just put the ban on his whole family, the whole house of Eli. So I think it's a pretty safe assumption that he is with David, and that's how we should read this. Go ahead.
So you believe that Gad is still there with them, and that he turns to Gad and not Abiathar the priest. Then is what you're thinking. Is that what you were saying?
No. Well, I think that both of them would be with David. I think we talked about this last time,
right.
that all indications are that Gad seems to be someone who is going to stick around and hang out with David for some time, even after he is ruling as king. So I think they're both with him. But what I'm saying is that the Hebrew idiom of inquire of the Lord, this is a priestly idiom. This is not something that you would say
gotcha. Yep.
It's like if you say, like, I went to confession or something like this, right? If you say it like that, you would not mean that I told my wife I was sorry. Right. I mean,
right.
except for maybe like in a humorous way or something like this. Right. So similarly, because it's this kind of idiom, right, they're both there, but it would refer to Abiathar and not to Gad, who's a prophet, but it doesn't say anywhere, at least I recall, that he's also a priest. Which I think kind of sets this up a little bit more then. So, okay, so he's inquiring of this priest. So is he just inquiring of the priest just because, like, well, hey, I got a priest here, so I may as well get his take on it, right? Or is there something more to it? And I do think there is something more to it, because I was reminded a lot of Jonathan back in chapters 13 and 14, right, where he, it says, is looking for a sign from the Lord, right? He's looking for a sign because, he's there with his father. But he decides to sneak off, and he wants to perhaps go, attack some Philistines. But he does not have the permission of his father to do this. And so I think this is actually pretty key on this level, too. We've talked about faithfulness and devotion, right? Like, is it really David's place to go and fight the Philistines in this place, right? Because he's not the king, right? I mean, and especially, this is an intriguing idea that was brought up on Facebook. It says, so Paul was just saying here that Keilah is a border town between Saul, the Philistines, and David. Probably switched hands a number of times. So if it's in this situation here and they are asking for help from Saul and he doesn't send any help, right? Who is he to override, right, the decision of the king? I think on a certain level he's not in any position. I mean, what do you think?
No, that's right on. I mean, because he is not the one that would be in charge of those matters, and so he goes to the one. It's kind of like going over the boss's head, to the guy at the very top, and so so it makes sense. You see something of David's nature too. I think in that he's not trying to create offense. but he's just trying to make sure that he's in line with where he needs to be in relationship to the king and to God yet, even though the king is out pursuing him.
Well, and I think it ties in perfectly with everything else that we see. Just throughout these chapters. In the next chapter, we're going to see that he spares Saul's life, and he explicitly says it's because he is the Lord's Messiah, and he's not going to do that. So, I do think there are some important ways here that David is showing respect, right, to the king who's trying to kill him, which really should show us a lot, I think, about the posture of faith, which is consistent with like the disciples of our Lord Jesus. That they also showed as much as possible submissiveness and respect, even to the authorities that were in many ways illegitimate and after them, which is, I think, really instructive for our own situation, because we're like thinking to ourselves, oh, this is overreach, that this is illegitimate, and people are saying lots of things like that, and those may be true, right? But I think the Christian position is that we would still show submissiveness and respect.
Right, exactly. And we see that in Paul's life, too. We see it again and again.
That's right. Yeah, no, again and again. So we've got this situation now, so he inquires of the Lord, and the Lord is saying, well, go down to Keilah. And so since the Lord's saying it, it's like, well, okay, I would listen to what, go along with the precedent set by Saul, but right, Saul's boss has spoken, so it's like Supreme Court overrules the president or something like that, and you're like, all right, well, that's what we're doing then. So he goes, and it says he rescues Keilah. It's kind of described in just very quick detail here, because it's like there's just no space for it. It's like, I'm sure there was a whole song for like David's victory, right? But we just have to move on, right. And so it says here. When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David to Keilah, so he also went down there. It says he had come down with an ephod. So, okay, this is the question that was on Facebook. So how are you reading all this? An ephod, the ephod, how many of these things are there, right? Like, what's the status of this thing in verse 6?
Well, I was trying to recall. I believe the ephods were the clothes of the priests that were. I thought they were made out of the temple curtain, if I remember right, or at least the material from that. And it just acknowledged that they were part of the priests, that were the priests that served the Lord. That's all I really know of the ephod.
Well, I think that. On a certain level, I think this is helpful. On a certain level, it is just kind of part of the clothing, right? And it is a part, as you were saying, of the clothing that does identify the priests with the worship in the tabernacle and later the temple, right? So there's that association there.
And it's not just any clothing. It's clothing that
no, right.
Is representative of the curtain in the temple where the presence of God is. And so that's right. I think that this clothing would have a lot higher significance.
That's right.
For the people.
That's right. No, it's specifically a cultic garment in the sense of you would only be wearing this in the context of these official worship functions.
Yes.
So we have that there were a number. It says in the last chapter, right, there were like 80. I think that's the way they referred to like the priests. There were 85 who were wearing the ephod, right? Is that how they put it?
Mm-hmm.
I think previous chapter. Yep. So on the one hand, he is bringing down an ephod. It's his ephod, right? On the other hand, right, there does seem to be the ephod. As in, like, the one that the high priest is wearing, right? And that one's different. I don't think, because we read in Exodus, right? And then there's this breast piece that's got, like, these 12 gemstones, right? And all this with the names engraved. Mm-hmm. I don't think every single priest had those things. So there were some unique things about the high priest's ephod. So I think that there's kind of a little bit of a flexibility here where you can say, like, yeah, he had an ephod in his hand, right? On the other hand, he does seem to be I mean, who would be in line to be the high priest? I mean, this is very awkward, actually, because I don't think there's been time to like install him as the new high priest, because I think Saul just killed the high priest with Doeg. So, I mean, I think Abiathar stands to be next in line, but I mean, this is a really kind of really awkward and tumultuous time. I think that Abiathar, by all rights, is the one who should have the ephod, like the high priestly one. But I mean, this is, I mean, it's just really, I mean, anyways, I think we can kind of relate to the situation where it's like, we haven't even had time to do things and have the ceremony and meet in person. It's all just chaos.
Yeah. Well, good point. That's a very good point. Yeah. And that's, that's why it's helpful to be able to follow, chapters before, because if you get to this chapter and somebody's just coming in, like all of us pastors do, we come in on a chapter, and if we haven't done our homework at all, we're going to be totally lost when you're coming through these stories. And so some of the things that you're connecting back to is very helpful in trying to understand what we're looking at here.
Yeah, no, I mean, all of this is assuming the stuff that we've read before. And, right, like, there's a lot of times where it just doesn't go into a lot of detail because, well, I mean, the Hebrews that first heard this story would not have needed all this extra detail, right? So I mean, it is. I mean, that wasn't something actually I'd really kind of stopped and pondered a little bit, that there really is this awkwardness of, and we saw this actually in the previous chapter about the awkwardness of Saul's kingship, that, just he seems to be invalidating himself on a certain level, yet he is really the king. And so similarly here, it's like, well, the high priest died, so his son should be the. I mean, so if Ahimelech died, Abiathar is next in line. But do we have like the official transfer of power ceremony, right? With like we did with Aaron and Eleazar? No, couldn't do that. So I mean, there's like, I think a lot of like just ambiguity in this chapter. Is it right to go and save these people if I'm not the king? Is he really the king? Is he really the high priest? Right? It's a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's just vague. But I mean, I think it's comforting in that way that even in the midst of circumstances where it's just, what's the right thing to do? What's real? What's official? What has the blessing of God? That God's still working in the midst of uncertainties.
Right. Yeah. So but it is kind of interesting though that if. I think we probably do believe that, in the inquiry, the initial inquiry, we don't know if it was David or not. But here it's identified as David as he's inquiring on the Lord, in verse 10. I don't know if you're that far along yet, but, here we have David actually turning to the Lord and making the inquiry about Keilah there and whether or not they would be surrendered over into the hand of Saul. And of course, he's saying there's what I believe that's where you were talking about back in verse 9. That he asks the priest, bring the ephod here, or the ephod here, and then it says, and then said David, O Lord God of Israel, and he asks about whether or not they'd be surrendered into the hands of Saul.
Well, no, and so when you're right when he says, bring it here, and it's just, made absolutely clear that this inquiry, has this going on. And I think too that maybe that maybe some of this is just kind of like, I mean, it's just kind of more natural. Like now that we kind of have established already, back in verse 6 that, oh, by the way, we know that, he came down with an ephod, so we know that there's one there, right? And so now that we know that there's one, he can say, go get the thing, right, that you brought. So it's just kind of, natural way to be a little bit more expansive here. But so he's asking for this though about, will they come when Saul comes, right? Will these people give me up? And this is like what just immediately sent me to Psalm 31, because this is a psalm that I think we are guilty of misreading all the time. There's no superscription on Psalm 31 that is very specific It's not like it says, the time that he was in Keilah or something like this, right? But just, some of the language, it's just really something. He says, in the opening verse, in you, O Lord, do I take refuge. And then verse 2, be a rock of refuge for me. And then in verse 3, my rock and my fortress. So he's using like all this like rock fortress language that we're going to see, right? And that we have seen already in the rest of this chapter, right? And then I think that the big thing that we maybe overlook, it says in verse 10, you have this picture of it says here. I'm just going to go ahead and on the live stream to just move us over to Psalm 31 really quick. But there's this language of wasting away, which is consistent with what we were saying about what happens when you're under siege, right? When you're not eating. And in verse 11, because of all my adversaries, I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. Right. So and then in verse 13, they scheme together against me. So I think this picture is exactly the picture of what we're looking at here in 1 Samuel chapter 23, that he's on the run, but wherever he goes, people look at him as an object of dread. He is a reproach. No one wants him in their city because they know that Saul's going to come and put them, to siege if they find out that David's there.
Right, because they appear as being one who's harboring him, and he's like a hot potato. Nobody wants him. They want to send him somewhere else. Don't have him here. And that is exactly how those in the land were seeing David at that time. That's for sure. And that's why there was so much reporting back and forth to the king and to where David is constantly. That had to be the drama of the day. Wherever David ended up, and wherever people knew that he was at.
Well, and so you think of this situation, and it just seems like, okay, well, this is bad, right? Like, who's going to take David? No one's going to want this guy. Everyone's going to, once they find out, once Saul's people find out that he's there, they're going to give him up, right? Who's going to actually stand by David? Like what city is going to say, we'll go down with David. Instead of giving him up at some point, right? Like who's going to do that? No one. But so at the very end, right? So he's, we're skipping down a little bit here, but just because we're kind of on this point about the siege and the wandering here. So So it says there in verse 24. So they were in the wilderness of Maon in the Arabah, the south of, and this is one of these things, like it's like Jeshimon or something like that. And our English tradition, of course, doesn't sound like that at all in Hebrew, but we're just, it's how all these names are. But so he's in this situation, right? And it seems like, okay, like, is he going to, who's going to like stick by him? Just because it says the wilderness doesn't mean that he's like out like in the woods. It's pretty likely that he's in some kind of city or dwelling there in the wilderness. And in fact, that's kind of what it says in verse 28. It says there, he lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi, for example. So, I mean, this is, I think, the one that really lines up neatly with Psalm 31, that, okay, he's in this city. It's like, okay, yeah, these people are going to be like the people in Keilah. They're going to give me up too, right? So what am I supposed to do? And then, oh, hey, the Philistines are attacking the homeland. Saul's got to call it off, right? I mean, I think that's how David gets saved by God's hand in Psalm 31.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. I like that connection that you're making there too. With Psalm 31, that God is the rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. And David definitely had seen and knew that the Lord was always going to be there to give him strength. As I mentioned earlier, that was always David's first move was always, before he did anything, was to seek out what the Lord's will is. And of course, for him, the Lord is a rock, the Lord is his refuge. And even in the face of all of those enemies and all of those around him who had nothing to do with him. So, the only one that really he could turn to at that point is the Lord.
Absolutely. And, well, it's interesting, this, just you mentioning this again, just this rock, fortress, refuge language again and again. You can see why David would have been very fond of it, because he spent, it seems, some time, right, just hiding out in these different places. And it just seems that, it's just a fascinating way of thinking about it, that, it's like you were saying earlier, these fortresses or these rocks, right? Because fortresses at this time were very often built into rocks, right? It was much easier when you didn't have to build all four walls yourself, and you could just kind of, put the bars and gates on the front of a natural phenomenon, right? Something part of the topography. But like you were saying, it's like the difference between this being a prison and a fortress. I mean, it's pretty close. So at the end of the day, it's like not really the bars that are the things that are the fortress that keeps him safe, but it's God, because, God's actually the one who's moving around all the circumstances to make it. And so that he names the place Rock of Escape. I mean, it's like these other places in scriptures where, a rock gets named where, really it's referring to God as the Rock of Escape.
Yeah, and I think we also need to remember that all of what's happening to David here, again, is going to add to his character, his relationship of faithfulness with his Lord and trust, and all of this is preparing him to one day become king, and to have gone through these experiences himself will make him more wise as far as other situations that he would encounter as a king later on. So sometimes that's not always easy to see, and it would be interesting to just see what took place in these chapters where Saul is pursuing him, where there's this complete rift, and then later on, King David, David becomes king. And all of these experiences are going to be a part of what happens going forward, too, as far as his decision-making, the way in which he handles things.
I think so, that this is God in his providence really getting his king ready. Like we said last time, he is becoming so sympathetic, right, with the people who are rejected and turned away, and no one wants them, right? I mean, this kind of feels in that way. There's that Christmas tradition. How historically accurate it is another question, but of the going around from door to door and being turned away, like what as we have in our Christmas plays with the Holy Family, right? But just in any case, just the idea of God using those circumstances to prepare the king so that he has a heart for the rejected and the oppressed, because he was like that himself. And so just a picture of how the Messiah of God, whether it's David, foreshadowing it here, or Christ later, he becomes one of us and saves us as such.
Yes, very good. Yes.
Well, brother, thank you for joining the conversation and just bouncing around some ideas here and taking us through this chapter. Looking forward to have you on again soon. Like I said, blessings on reopening worship in person.
Thank you so much. It's always a joy. Thank you, and God bless you as well.
Thank you, brother. Everybody, Curtis Deterding, Zion, Fort Myers, Florida. Moving on to chapter 24. Till then, I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. Peace.
The official broadcast ministry of the LCMS. Your support is vital for this program to continue. You can make a gift safe, secure, and easily online at kfuo.org. Thank you for listening and supporting Thy Strong Word.